Hey, so I'm Doug Kibbee. I'm a retired professor of French linguistics at the University of Illinois. And most of my work had been concentrated on grammar writing, dictionary writing, and the relationship of those activities to social power in England and France in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so it's quite a leap forward for me to turn my attention to 21st century America. Two experiences in French-speaking countries, in Quebec and in France, and seeing how they were approaching language issues in their societies made me wonder, when I came back to the United States, exactly what was happening here. I had no clue, to tell you the truth, and so it's been about a 20-year investigation of how we do things here. I say that I had this French experience. I was in Quebec when they were debating independence, basically on language issues. I was in France when they were debating a law that was mainly combating the influence of English in French culture. And so when I came back to the US, I started investigating what we did, and then I created a course on language and law in the United States. And there were no books to use for this course, so I really created this book in response to the absence of a comprehensive picture of language issues in the United States. Well, I'd like to approach that through impact on individuals. One of the things I tried to do in this book was to personalize the effect of the law on people. So, for instance, on democracy, there was a 21-year-old hotel worker in Rochester, New York, who was denied the right to vote because she couldn't pass an English literacy test. She was from Puerto Rico, and she couldn't pass an English literacy test in the state of New York, which was a requirement for voting at that time in the mid-60s. So that's one way among many that have been used to try and suppress votes from language minority voters, potential voters. And for justice, take the example of Jose Negron, who was a farm worker in Suffolk County in Long Island. He was accused of murdering another man. At his trial, he had no interpreter, so he had no clue what was going on. He could not contradict the testimony of the other witnesses. And so he was convicted and sent to prison. And it was only on that appeal then that the U.S. started organizing official court interpreting requirements. Another example for justice, Dionisio Hernandez, I think was in Brooklyn, who was being tried for, I think it was maybe attempted murder. He had fired some shots in the street, and the prosecutor dismissed all Latino jurors, potential jurors, from the jury panel. And so was he really being tried by an impartial jury of his peers, or was he being tried by a biased jury? In fairness, one aspect of that is how people treat people who speak with an accent. So take the case of Manuel Fragante, who was a Filipino-American who had worked for the U.S. Army for 20 years, lived in Kansas, then moved to Hawaii. He came in first in the civil service test for a job there, but he was denied the job because the people thought he had an accent. When he appealed that decision, the judge said, "Oh, I have trouble understanding you too, so, well, that's too bad." In the end, the court ruled because of the judge's inability to understand, unwillingness to understand Mr. Fragante. He was denied that job, but the Hawaii Department of Motor Vehicles gave him another job where all the work was answering the phone, which is hard to imagine that phone conversation is much harder for a person with an accent than anything else. I think the gaps come, we have the ideals in America of everybody has the opportunity to realize their dream, a self-made person, but then we throw all sorts of barriers in their way when they try to do so. I think the problem is in the majority culture. The majority culture in America is mostly monolingual, has no understanding of how hard it is to operate in a second language. And I mean, I know from my own experience, I've been studying French for 50 years. There's still things I can't say in France, still things that are hard for me to figure out. So part of the problem is just ignorance, you know, that people are monolingual and don't understand what the problems are for somebody who doesn't speak their language. Another problem is simply the desire to retain power, and this is where sort of the Trump mentality comes in, the desire to retain power for the existing elite by using any means, including language, to repress the people who are trying to take their place in society. There's also an element, I would say, I'd call this the fraternity hazing argument. So for people whose families now immigrated 100 years ago, and they say, oh, well, my family suffered through all sorts of indignities to become American citizens and to learn English and so forth, so these people should too. And it's not that everybody isn't trying to learn English. I think the opportunities are not there. Often the educational system is not providing adult education or enough adult education for people who want it and need it. But I think there's the lack of sympathy for what people are going through on the idea that, well, my family suffered through it, so all newcomers should suffer through the same thing. Language law is a kind of moving target because things are changing on a daily basis. Somebody was just telling me yesterday, the day before, that a English language requirement for taxi drivers in New York had just been abandoned. And so now taxi drivers are no longer required to pass an English test to be licensed in New York. Second element is that there are 50 states, and each state is different, and the history of each state is different. Some states, like Louisiana, had a very strong French presence for a long time. Wisconsin and Minnesota had strong German and Scandinavian influence for a long time. Chicago's always had a huge immigrant community, and so the attitudes there are different than in places like Kansas or Oklahoma, where you don't have the same population diversity. There are 50 states, there are 10,000 municipalities or more, I'm not sure how many there are. Each of those also has its own track record in dealing with language issues. And there are 400 languages spoken in the United States, so that's another complication. I think many of the other readings that I tried to find for my students when I was teaching this course only dealt with one language minority. They would deal with the Latino minority, or they would deal with, say, the Chinese American minority, but they wouldn't look comprehensively at the issues that covered all the different languages. I think people should read this book because linguistic inequality is largely unrecognized in the United States, and it's a grave threat, I think, to the ideals of the country. So I hope this will open people's eyes and show them that this is a very serious issue. There are 60 million Americans for whom English is a second language. That's a big chunk of the population, almost 20%. So we need to take seriously how we can integrate, incorporate, allow to contribute the genius of all these people who are coming in whose only barrier is language.